Dr. Brzezinski, let's talk about that. I mean, all of your government experience, and I imagine the conversations that you still have now that obviously you're in a think tank environment now, but you're probably interacting with government actors all the time. What's the sort of federal government's posture on this right now?
I mean, there's great concern, obviously. FDA has always been very concerned about drug shortages. They have a whole team that tries to help mitigate shortages. You might have heard that the White House is very interested in and has people working on it. You saw that CMS just put out a proposed rule where they're trying to think about buffer inventories. There's a lot of interest in Congress. They're thinking about creating bills. And but before I go there, I just wanted to add one more thing back to the point about when this particular problem started. Yep. What is making this current problem worse, which has to do with the fact that, the manufacturer that had the inspection was at the end of November. In January, there were already stories, the 483 came out. 483 is the list of deficiencies that the FDA issues to the manufacturer about what problems there were with good manufacturing practices. So the information out there about problems was actually back in January. And what ended up happening, the sales data for cisplatin and carboplatin, is that the sales in the first quarter of the year went through the roof. Basically, what started happening is that some players were really paying attention and they started buying way more than they ever were buying before. And so what you ended up happening, not only did you have a supply disruption, but suddenly you had this huge increase in demand and a lot more product. And so in a sense, a lot of the product has left, has shifted through the supply channels. And there were a lot of health hospital systems that are probably in a pretty good position with a buffer inventory, but others that sort of didn't realize what was happening, and that's particularly true of community clinics. They sort of were at the end of the line in trying to get that product and having a lot more problems. What you actually frequently see in shortages is that there might be a supply disruption, but then there's this massive buildup in demand that only exacerbates the shortage. When you have, even if other manufacturers start to try to make up production, just the demand is so high because everybody wants to create a buffer that they weren't holding before. Yeah. So that actually sort of complicates in some ways, some of the policy responses, because this issue of panic buying is very real, and it sort of exacerbates existing shortages. So, as I mentioned, there is a lot going on right now. It is a really complex problem that sort of not just points to the FDA, but it points back. It's in a sense, it's a self-inflicted wound, if I were to say so. Yeah. Hospitals, a lot of it has to do with how hospitals buy drugs. And the fact that these are all therapeutically equivalent products, they're FDA approved, FDA is supposed to hold the line. We might just as well buy the cheapest drug that we can. And what ends up happening is that the hospitals, through how they buy, put so much pressure on manufacturers that it gives manufacturers an incentive to kind of skirt on their manufacturing quality systems. And FDA can't hold the line, not only they don't have infinite resources, but because when push comes to shove, and there is a possibility for a shortage, everybody screams at the FDA, be flexible, be flexible. But being flexible means you're not an enforcer like you should be. And so what ends up happening is that FDA ends up putting a lot of band-aids. They try to kind of nudge the manufacturers. They try to do this. But if it's medically necessary products and the drug is, and the manufacturer has enough of a market share and we're afraid of shortages, you end up basically coming into this bad equilibrium. So I completely agree. What's next? Because there's going to be this sort of is a really bad set of dynamics that we have at play. And I think what's really for us to be thinking about, not putting on band-aids, how do we deal and mitigate shortages? To prevent shortages, we would actually have to change how hospitals buy.
Well, what you're describing there is a little bit of what I've read about in other areas in terms of artificial price sort of wars that go in the wrong direction, which is a cycle, almost like a stampede kind of mentality, which is someone senses a panic, as you mentioned, use the word panic, and then there's a big buy, and then everyone else says, uh-oh, we better get in on that. And all of a sudden, you do have an artificial supply problem based simply on the fact that people are kind of hoarding in anticipation of a shortage. Is that basically what happened?
I mean, that's what happens when a shortage actually happens. And I mean, think about to COVID and toilet paper shortages, right?
Right.
I mean, you know, the change wasn't so massive, but I think everybody got so nervous about being out of toilet paper that they ended up spending a lot more. And what ends up happening is that once things calm down, once, for example, a shortage is resolved, what manufacturers expect is actually a dramatic drop in orders, which actually gives them an incentive to not necessarily expand their production that much, because they know once things calm down, you know, everybody will want to draw their inventory. But that's not the cause of shortages. Those are sort of factors that exacerbate a shortage. The cause is the manufacturing quality problems that trigger a lot of these shortages. And the fact that manufacturers are not necessarily following good manufacturing practices, they're not investing in their systems. If we can prevent that from happening, we would not have to be dealing with a lot of these mitigation efforts. So they're just really fundamental market dynamics that I think have not been addressed and are not getting better at all. They just flare up every so often, and they flared up in cancer, but we had them for a lot of crash drugs in the past. There are many drugs that go into shortage. It's fundamentally, there's something broken in how the market works. And so that's why it just keeps on popping up.
Now, when a shortage happens, and the one I can think of that's the most recent in everyone's memory that was the infant formula shortage. That certainly sort of caught a lot of headlines just for obvious reasons. Can you explain to us what is, I mean, look, it is a Band-Aid, but what's the fastest thing that the quote unquote system, whether it's the FDA or CMS or, you know, other agencies or stakeholders can do just to plug the hole while we hopefully lean back and answer the question that you're talking about, which is how do we get here and how do we prevent that? But like if you're, you know, Dr. Kaplinsky and you like need to give drug tomorrow, what's the fastest thing that that can happen sort of to just to fill in the gap in the short term? What levers are there?
So I think in the short term, and this might actually be not necessarily a policy issue, but an issue that the stakeholders can agree on, is basically better allocation mechanisms. Not allowing you know, some to rush out of the gate and stockpile, is having automatic allocation come into place and being really thoughtful about what those allocation mechanisms are. So I think that would be the very first thing that I would think could help deal with shortages. Obviously, you know, buffering inventories can be helpful, but you need to do it before there's a shortage, right? This is not a mitigation strategy. And when it comes to sort of thinking about the longer term, is actually shifting the weight that hospitals pay to you know, place on manufacturing reliability and sort of history of reliability of supply, and paying more attention to that.
These are really life and death situations that we can't even measure, which is so frightening. And when those are the stakes, Dr. Lashinska, like, do you think that we're coming to a point where this sort of Wild West, everyone can do whatever they want, is not sufficient? And I think about, I kind of think sometimes about organ transplants, like, and how weird our system is on that, and how it's regulated, but it's not centralized. Like, and do you think that given how frequently this is happening in the stakes, that there needs to be a fundamental like reboot in just how the market works, or is it more like we got to anticipate and plug some holes?
No, I really think that we need to really address directly some of the fundamental failures in this market. Otherwise, we'll continue. You know, we will see these flare-ups. So we'll be trying to plug up the holes. What I worry about. So the sort of the silver lining in all of this is right now the policy window is open, and Congress is interested in this. But as soon as this shortage sort of wanes, and will at some point, you know, everybody will go back to what they were doing, and that's actually my fear.
Mm.
because we have an opportunity to do something about this, because this is a problem that's been going on for well over a decade, and it keeps on just flaring up here or there. And we have an opportunity to right now address it, to say this is not acceptable, and not just focus on the short term, how do we address this shortage, but think about how to prevent future ones.
Do you think COVID taught us anything about this? I mean, you mentioned toilet paper, but there was also drug shortages, and there was some talking point of sort of reliance on, China, for example, and other foreign bodies who we can't necessarily rely upon. Do you think that, in a sense, that we need to kind of diversify our supply lines? Is that a big piece of this, or is that more just kind of, again, just a fancier way of kind of plugging a hole?
Well, it doesn't plug the right hole. The exposure to, the geopolitical risks are a separate hole that right now is not really open. It's a theoretical hole.
Uh-huh.
Right now, that's not where we have had shortages. So we need to be worried about that hole, but that will not solve the manufacturing quality problem that we have. So we need to be addressing that head on if we want to make progress. So.
And does it really matter in terms of how old some of the drugs are? Because I know there's an issue of like whether something's on patent or whether something is generic. How does that affect this?
Brand manufacturers tend to have much more resilient supply chains. Their margins are lower. For them to stop producing for a month is a lot of profits going down the tubes, and potentially having these patients switch permanently to some other brand. For a generic, it's not like that. They have very, very low margins, and they will have one API supplier. They will have very little spare capacity. They will have only carry so much of the various sort of ingredients in the different stages. So it's very, very thin, and so they're much more vulnerable to all sorts of disruptions. So it really is, to a large extent, a generics issue. Just really quickly going back to COVID-related shortages were driven by demand increases. These are related largely to manufacturing quality disruptions. So the cause is a little bit different. The solution is a little bit, but what we can learn from COVID is that coordination is really important, and also thinking about allocation and thinking about it from the upstream perspective. There was a lot of planning that went into the fact that if we have a shortage, what are we going to do? Versus for a lot of these shortages, we just get kind of cut off, right? We knew that we're going to face shortages initially of vaccines, right? And so there was a lot of thinking about how can we do this, and the government stepping in, a lot of coordination on that front, thinking about allocation mechanisms. And, if until we start really seriously addressing the root causes of what triggers these shortages, we need to be spending a lot of time thinking about how to allocate the product, knowing that we're going to have shortages. And we're not even doing that.